Do you know what time it is? It's Supernatural StoryTime. And if you're easily scared, and even if you're not, there's only one thing left to do. Just turn off the lights, because these are stories that you listen to only in the dark. Fear the Forest. I've been a national park ranger for close to 2 decades. Protocols have changed a lot in that time. I write this just to try to keep people safe for the next time you venture to the big outdoors. Let me tell you about the last park I worked at. I can't be too specific about the location for my job's sake. Anyway, we had clusters of campsites that we rotated annually. The idea was to prevent one group from getting overused and worn down. Let nature regrow a little bit. The winter had just passed and our big summer season was a few months away. I was sent out to check the suitability of the campsites and to decide which ones needed time to recover and which ones we could open up. Winter here are cold. Not too many people camp during the winter, aside from rugged masochists and Boy Scout troop led by people who believe they are rugged masochists. I didn't expect to find much out of the ordinary. The first site was clear and ready to go. As I was trekking to the next site, I saw what looked like some debris and junk down a ways in a river valley. It looked like some jackasses set up an unauthorized camp down there. Usually when that happens, they leave garbage and smoldering fires. This was going to be a pain to clear up. I approached, and I saw the telltale wreckage of what must have been one hell of a party. Shit scattered everywhere, skeletons of tents still raised up, and blood. I stopped, and time stopped with me. Pools of blood were spread out along the ground, next to signs of something heavy being dragged into the brush. I pulled my radio off my belt and paused. I then pulled my Glock 22 out of my holster and racked one round. I'm a certified law enforcement officer, but I haven't had to use my gun in a long time. I quickly looked around for any movement, then got on my radio and called in for backup. While I waited, I listened. Silence. Silence in nature isn't good. Prey get quiet when they sense a predator. I hoped all the birds were being still on my account. I edged forward slowly, looking for anyone or anything. A shredded plastic cooler. A tent that had been annihilated, with more blood splashed on the walls inside. People died here. I knew it. You can't lose that much blood and just walk off. But no people. Shreds of clothes and a little viscera, drawing all the goddamn flies here, but no people. I've seen bears rummage through camps and destroy anything that looked edible. There are wild hogs here that cut trails through the deep brush and are even more dangerous than the bears. But this isn't either of them. The devastation here, it's just too much. Some scourge of God came through here and just ripped everything to pieces. My backup finally arrived and I was sent to report to HQ. They even brought medics out here. I don't know why. There's no one here to save. When the new recruits vomited at the scene, I'm glad to get the hell out of here. I got back to the headquarters and it's a buzz. Only 4 people work here, but calls are ringing, printers printing, and the air feels electrified. The manager saw me and signaled me to his office. He's pale, ashen-looking with bloodshot eyes. I sat down by his desk and he went to the door and locked it. I've never seen him lock that door. He asked me what I saw. I told him, uninterrupted. He looked even paler afterwards and his hand trembled a bit. There's a very long pause and I expected more questions. He doesn't ask any. I left, then could hear the door lock behind me. After a few minutes, I heard him call someone up, and a long, low conversation ensued. I never saw him again. Word came down from on high. We were assigned a new manager, one who excelled at what he called a crisis. His first order of business, a controlled burn of the unauthorized camp and the sites closest to it. I'm not arguing. I watched the smoke rise in the distance and prayed that that was the end of it. New orders. Relocate the existing campsites closer to HQ. Before we do that, We stake out a few trail cameras at the new locations just to make sure it's not in the middle of a nesting ground. We put up a few cameras pointed at the hog trails through the brush just for good measure. A couple of days passed and we went out to collect the footage. The new manager takes it on and started studying it in his office. A couple of hours into reviewing it, he freaked out, started screaming and yelling, got on the phone, called up on the line spitting more obscenities. He spent the rest of the day and that night in the office calling up specialists and planners. Next morning, I showed up for a meeting. Manager doesn't look like he slept. Massive changes afoot. He laid out our new plans, including massively bright lampposts circling the park border as well as floodlights around the ranger station. Campsites need to be moved even closer. Clear lines of sight from the light, if possible. I butted in, telling him that defeats the point of going camping. If you're just going on a short walk through the grass, then standing up so close, you can see the parking lot. He tells me to shut up, and that was just the start. The park now closes at sundown sharp. Also, we're now required to have a long gun on our person at all times. Now, it isn't uncommon for rangers to carry an AR-15 or Remington 870 shotgun going out in the deep woods. There are wild and rabid animals out there. The real concern are massive pot growers. These aren't your chill neighbor who hides a few plants behind the tomatoes. They run the spectrum from large-scale suppliers who like their privacy and dislike law enforcement to anti-government crazies who think that we have no right over them. Both groups have a few common points. They tend to be well-armed. They do not like lawmen, and they won't shy away from taking a pot shot at some dumb poor ranger who finds himself in their field. Keep in mind, Elliot Ness, Mr. I fought Al Capone, and one got scared off busting up Appalachian moonshiners because they constantly sniped at him from the foothills. They shoot to kill. Those are the reasons we kept the big guns around, not routine patrols. I drew the short straw and got the overnight shift. The manager told me more changes to the protocol would be listed when I returned. Overnights used to be easy. Monitor the radios, bust up the parties if needed, check for poachers if they're operating nearby, make sure the forest doesn't burn down. I clocked in and per instructions went to the gun cage. Things have changed. Our shotguns have new rifled barrels that they can handle the solid slugs we've been issued. That's the kind of firepower you want to take down a charging bear. God forbid you ever need it. The AR-15s have been stepped up too. The old 15-round magazines have been replaced by 30-round ones. Someone even snuck in hollow point rounds. Makes no damn sense. Shooting in the woods, you need full metal jacket ammo so the rounds don't go wild when they touch a twig. Hollow points just exist to do more tissue damage. This is ridiculous. This is overkill. We're not a war zone. We don't need this firepower. Next to the radio, there were new instructions. Now we were not allowed to directly respond to emergency calls. We could reply, figure out what the issue was, then report to a new phone number that I didn't recognize. Time passed by very slowly that night. I wasn't even allowed to leave the building until sunup. A few uneventful nights passed. New floodlights and lampposts were frying my eyes. It was so bright out there that a blind man could see. A week later, some kids rolled into the lot. They grabbed their backpacks and started hiking up the ridge. I know what they're up to. No one has booked a campsite that night. Cheap young ones going on a camp out. That'll be a raging party. I waited for the sun to go down, confirming that they were not out for a day hike. I called my manager to report. He instructed me to call the new number. I reported up to them now. A curt voice answered the phone. He asked my part, then paused. He asked the issue. Bunch of kids on an unauthorized site. Do I go break it up? I can see their campfire out on the ridge right now. No. Do not leave the building. Do not attempt communication. That is all. Report if there are any developments. Right after daybreak, the manager writes up. It's really early. Have you seen them? Did they leave? No. The car's still there. Let them rest. They're probably all hungover. He cursed nonstop. He then went inside to make a call. I was outside looking up the ridge when he exited the station. One AR-15 in his hand, another one strapped across his back, Glock on his hip. He marched single-mindedly towards his car. I tried to ask him what in God's name he was doing, but he wasn't listening or responding. He took a jerry can of gasoline from his car and marched up the ridge. I yelled after him. Still no reply. I considered following him, but that doesn't seem like a good idea. I went back inside and called the number. The same curt voice, the same direct questions. Yeah, the manager went up to that campsite, armed to the teeth, and carrying gasoline. What the fuck do I do? Stay there. Do not interfere. Backup is inbound. Report if there are any developments. About the same time, I started to see smoke wafting off the ridge. 2 vans rode into the lot at screaming speed. A dozen men, heavily armed and armored, exited quickly. I went out to check. Who are you guys? What's going on? The men all lined up with that impeccable military position. One of them, a commander, I assumed, exited the last vehicle, and he said, "Which direction did he go?" "I mean, he's up there," I pointed at the increasing smoke. The man fanned out and started jogging up the ridge. I heard their rifles cocking as they left. I tried to shout after them, but got no response. I looked at the vans that they had come in, large, nondescript. They just said DOI response team on the side. Half an hour later they returned, dragging the manager with them. He was bound in zip ties, and he was screaming. "I did what needed to be done. Trust me, it's worse than they thought. We can't stop this. Burn it all." They threw him in the back and sedated him. The commander approached me. My neck hair bristled in cold fear. "I need to see the office. All computers and anything with a hard drive is coming with me." He mentioned videotapes. I need those too. I unlocked the doors and they ransacked the place. Everything got taken. Printed reports from the last few years disappeared into those vans. The videotapes got bagged up and held by the commander himself. He studied the gun cage. "Cute. You're out of your league," he scoffed. Finally, they found everything they looked for. The commander tells me, "Call the number, tell them it's contained. You need a new superior. Also, don't talk about this to anyone." They left, and just on cue, the 1st Brigade and a few new vans show up. The fire was contained, the new report said. Rumors of missing campers are unsubstantiated at this time. Still, the rumors alone are enough to scare off the season's campers. The quick change-up of managers is chalked up to bureaucracy. The press dies down after a week or two, and the new manager is very good at dealing with them. Thankfully, with no new campers and our now even shorter open hours, we can get more work done around here. Rebuilding the station took some time, and we just set up new campsites. They're practically spitting distance from the station. Nothing dramatic happens for a few days, and then, on a whim, the manager tells us to set up some cameras around the station and the campsites. There's usually so much human activity around here, all you see are some raccoons. Maybe the rare hungry bear, but we humor him and set them up all around. A couple of days passed and we collected the footage. I played poker with one of the rookies while the manager watched hours of footage of an empty but brilliantly illuminated parking lot. Then he got to the footage around the station. Screams started coming from his office. We barged in and he was stamping on the camera's hard drive, gibbering things I couldn't understand, along the lines of, "Told me it was clean, safe. No recent activity. Bullshit. Here, I'm not gonna do it." He barked at us to leave. Later he made a call. The rookie went up to his door and listened in. Then the rookie came back and made a report. Yeah, he's demanding a transfer. They lied to him. Said something about that they didn't do their jobs properly, that he's not prepared or equipped here. Then I just heard the phone click and some sobbing. Hours later, my manager exited the office. His shoulders were slumped and defeated. We cut our hours even further, practically open on weekends only. We'll have a full staff ready those days, but a skeleton crew the rest of the time. Campers are required to check in to one of the closest sites, no campsite, and they're told to leave. We're not authorized to leave the station after dark under any circumstances. And in an emergency, do not call 911. Call the number and do exactly what they say. We drew straws as to who got the overnight shifts. Why we needed to stay overnights if we didn't do anything is beyond me. So I asked the manager about it, and he just said that was standard protocol, which was to have someone on hand to report any irregularities overnight. I had to work the overnight shift, and I kept the phone close, the number dialed in, ready if I needed to call. It was a bad night. I just wound up pacing around with my shotgun, glancing into the bright floodlights, trying to see what was past them. I heard crickets, and that relaxed me. Prey is quiet when predators are close. It was a long night. The next night, my manager drew the short straw. He seemed resigned. In the end, we all have to take a turn. He brought the brightest damn tactical flashlight I've ever seen. Said he brought it just because he's afraid of the dark. He isn't really. He's afraid of the thing in the dark. I got a phone call at about 3 a.m. It was him. Get over here now and bring guns. What? You have a damn arsenal. Now, or I swear to God I fucked up. Oh man, I think they're attracted to the light. I called that number, and all they said was backup would be here in the morning. Oh fuck, goddamn. I had the piercing staccato of gunshots. A pause. More gunshots. Screaming, scuffling. The line went dead. I called the number. A new terse voice answered. Look, I work at... And I just got off the phone with... And I just spoke... What can you report? Something bad happened. It's serious. I heard gunshots. We will have backup there as soon as possible. Did he say anything else? Yeah, he said he thought that they were attracted to the light. Doesn't make sense to me. Interesting. Thank you for your report. The park is now closed. You will be reassigned. Goodbye. Click. Officially, the park was closed to be scheduled for a controlled burn. Let the old trees die and make room for new ones. There was nothing in the official report about what happened to the manager on duty. The public understanding was bureaucracies need to be shaken up on occasion. No one asked any more questions. I got transferred to a new park, halfway across the country. Change of scenery and beautiful. They've got some odd rules here too. Don't go out after dark, and don't carry a flashlight. I'm concerned about why. Why can't you use a flashlight at night when you need one? They won't tell me. Be safe, everyone. Forest stories. I've been an SAR officer for a few years now, and along the way I've seen some things that I think you'll really be interested in. I have a pretty good track record for finding missing people. Most of the time they just wander off the path or slip down a small cliff, and they can't find their way back. The majority of them have heard the old stay where you are thing, and they don't wander far. But I've had 2 cases where that didn't happen. Both bother me a lot, and I use them as a motivation to search even harder on the missing person cases when I get called. The first was a little boy who was out berry picking with his parents. He and his sisters were together, and both of them went missing around the same time. Their parents lost sight of them for a few seconds, and in that time both kids apparently wandered off. When their parents couldn't find him, they called us, and we came out to search the area. We found the daughter pretty quickly, and when we asked where her brother was, she told us that she'd been taken away by the bear man. She said he gave her berries and told her to stay quiet, that he wanted to play with her brother for a while. The last she saw of her brother, he was riding on the shoulders of the bear man and seemed calmed. Of course, our first thought was abduction. But we never found a trace of another human being in that area. The little girl was also insistent that he wasn't a normal man, but that he was tall and covered in hair, like a bear, and that he had a weird face. We searched that area for weeks. It was one of the longest calls I've ever been on, but we never found a single trace of that kid. The other was a young woman who was out hiking with her mom and grandpa. According to the mother, her daughter had climbed up a tree to get a better view of the forest, and she never came back down. They waited at the base of the tree for hours, calling her name before they called for help. Again, we searched everywhere, and we never found a trace of her. I have no idea where she could possibly have gone, because neither her mother or her grandfather saw her come down. A few times I've been out on my own searching with a canine, and they've tried to lead me straight up a cliff. Not hills, not even rock faces, straight sheer cliffs with no possible handholds. It's always baffling, and in those cases, we usually find the person on the other side of the cliff or miles away from where the canine had led us. I'm sure there's an explanation, but it's sort of strange. One particularly sad case involved the recovery of a body. A 9-year-old girl fell down an embankment and got impaled on a dead tree at the base. It was a complete freak accident, but I'll never forget the sound her mother made when we told her what had happened. She saw the body bag being loaded into the ambulance, and she let out the most haunting, heartbroken wail I've ever heard. It was like her whole life was crashing down around her, and a part of her had died with her daughter. I've heard from another SAR officer that she killed herself a few weeks after it happened. She couldn't live with the loss of her daughter. I was teamed up with another SAR officer because we've received reports of bears in the area. We were looking for a guy who hadn't come home from a climbing trip when he was supposed to, and we ended up having to do some serious climbing to get to where we figured he'd be. We found him trapped in a small crevasse with a broken leg. It was not pleasant. He'd been there for almost 2 days, and his leg was very obviously infected. We were able to get him into a chopper, and I heard from one of the EMTs that the guy was absolutely inconsolable. He kept talking about how he'd been doing fine, and when he'd gotten to the top, a man had been there. He said the guy had no climbing equipment, and he was wearing a parka and ski pants. He walked up to the guy, and when the guy turned around, he said he had no face. It was just blank. He freaked out and ended up trying to get off the mountain too fast, which is why he'd fallen. He said he could hear the guy all night, climbing down the mountain and letting out these horrible muffled screams. That story bothered the hell out of me. I'm glad I wasn't there to hear it. One of the scariest things I've ever seen happen involved the search for a young woman who had gotten separated from her hiking group. We were out until late at night because the dog had picked up her scent. When we found her, she was curled up under a large rotted log. She was missing her shoes and pack, and she was clearly in shock. She didn't have any injuries, and we were able to get her to walk with us back to the base ops. Along the way, she kept looking behind us and asking why that big man with black eyes was following us. We couldn't see anyone, so we just wrote it off as some weird symptom of shock. But the closer we got to base, the more agitated the woman got. She kept asking me to tell him to stop making faces at her. At one point, she stopped and turned around and started yelling into the forest, saying that she wanted him to leave her alone. She wasn't going to go with him, she said, and she wouldn't give us to him. We finally got her to keep moving, but we started hearing these weird noises coming from all around us. It was almost like coughing, but more rhythmic and deeper. It was almost insect-like. I don't really know how else to describe it. When we were within sight of base ops, the woman turned to me, and her eyes were about as wide as I can imagine a human could open them. She touched my shoulder and said, "He said to tell you to speed up. He doesn't like looking at the scar on your neck." I have a very small scar on the base of my neck, but it's mostly hidden under my collar, and I have no idea how this woman saw it. Right after she said it, I heard that weird coughing right in my ear, and I just about jumped out of my skin. I hustled her to ops, trying not to show how freaked out I was, but I have to say I was really happy when we left the area that night. This is the last one I'll tell, and it's probably the weirdest story. Now, I don't know if this is true, that every SAR unit, but in mine, it's sort of an unspoken regular thing we run into. You can try asking about it with other SAR officers, but even if they know what you're talking about, they probably won't say anything about it. We've been told not to talk about it by our superiors, and at this point, we've all gotten so used to it, it doesn't even seem weird anymore. On just about every case where we're really far into the wilderness, I'm talking 30 or 40 miles, at some point, we'll find a staircase in the middle of the woods. It's almost like if you took the stairs in your house, cut them out, and put them in the forest. I asked about it the first time I saw some, and the other officer just told me not to worry about it, that it was normal. Everyone I asked did the same thing. I wanted to go and check them out, but I was told very emphatically that I should never go near any of them. I just sort of ignore them now when I run into them because it happens so frequently. But let me tell you some other stories. As far as missing persons go, I'd say about half the calls I get are related to that. The others are rescue calls, people who fall down cliffs and hurt themselves. They get injured by fire. You wouldn't believe how often this happens, mostly drunk kids. Somebody gets bitten or stung by animals or insects. We're a tight team, and we've had veterans who are excellent at finding signs of lost people. That's what makes these cases where we never find any trace of them so frustrating. One in particular was upsetting for all of us because we did find a trace of them, but it just led to more questions than answers. An older man had been hiking alone on a well-established trail, but his wife called to say that he hadn't come home when he should have. Apparently, he had a history of seizures, and she was worried that he hadn't taken his medication and had suffered one out on the trail. Before you ask, I have no idea why he thought it was okay to go out alone, or why she didn't go with him. I don't ask about that kind of thing because past a certain point, it really doesn't matter. Someone is missing, and it's my job to find them. We went out in a standard search formation. It wasn't long before one of our vets found signs that the guy had gone off the trail. We grouped up and followed him, spreading out in a fan to make sure we were covering as much ground as possible. Suddenly, a call came over the radio telling us to head back to the vet's location. And we came right away because this usually meant that the missing person was injured, and we need a full team to help them get out safely. We met back up, and the vet was just standing at the base of a tree with his hands on the sides of his head. I asked my buddy what was going on, and he pointed up into the branches of the tree. I almost couldn't believe what I was seeing. But there's a walking stick dangling from a branch at least 30 feet off the ground. The little strap thing on the handle has been looped around the branch and is just hanging there. There's no way the guy could have tossed it up that far, and we don't see any other signs that he's still in the area. We got up back into the trees, but it's obvious that no one's in there. We all just sort of left scratching our heads. We kept searching for the guy, but we never found him. We even brought our canines out, but they lost the scent long before the tree. Eventually, the search was called off because there are other calls we had to attend to. And past a certain point, there's not much we can do. The guy's wife called us every day for months, asking if we'd found her husband. And it was heartbreaking to hear her get more and more hopeless each time. I'm not sure why this call in particular was so upsetting, but I think it was just the sheer improbability of it. That and the questions that were raised. How the hell had this guy's cane ended up there? Did someone kill him and toss that up there as some weird trophy? We did our best to find him, but it was almost like a taunt. We were still talking about that one from time to time. Missing kids are the most heartbreaking. Doesn't matter what circumstances they go missing under, it's never easy. And we always dread the ones we find deceased. It's not common, but it does happen. One of the stories involves a mother and her 3 kids, which were out for a picnic in an area of the park that had a small lake. One was 6, one 5, and the other one was about 3. She was watching them very closely, and according to her, she never let them out of her sight at any time. She never saw anyone else in the area either, which is very important. She packed her stuff up, and they started to head back to the parking area. Now, this lake is only about 2 miles into the woods, and is on a very clearly established trail. It's almost impossible to get lost getting from the parking area to it, unless you're deliberately going off the path like an imbecile. Her kids were walking in front of her when she heard what sounded like someone coming up the path behind her. She turned around, and in the 4 or so seconds she's not looking, her 5-year-old son vanishes. She figured he'd stepped off the trail to pee or something, and she asked her other 2 where he went. They both tell her that a big man with a scary face came out of the woods next to them, took the kid's hand, and led him into the trees. The 2 remaining kids don't seem upset. In fact, she said later that it seemed like they were drugged, that they were sort of spacey and fuzzy, so of course she freaked out, started looking frantically in the area for the kid. She's screaming his name, and she says at one point she thinks she heard him answer her. Now, obviously, she can't go blindly running into the woods. She's got the other 2 kids, so she calls the police and they send us out immediately. We responded and we started to search for him. Over the course of this search, which spans miles, we never found a single trace of the kid. Canines can't pick up a scent. We don't find any clothing or broken bushes or literally anything that could signify a child being there. Of course, there's suspicion about the mother for a while, but it's pretty clear that she's completely destroyed by the whole thing. We looked for this kid for weeks with a lot of volunteer help, but eventually the search petered out and we had to move on. The volunteers kept searching though, and one day we did get a call on the radio letting us know that a body had been found and that it needed to be recovered. They told us the location and none of us can believe it. We figured it had to be a different kid. But we went out there about 15 miles from the site where he vanished, and sure enough, we found the body of the kid we'd been looking for. I've been trying to figure it out, how this kid got where he did ever since we found him, and I never came up with an answer. A volunteer just happened to be in the area because he figured you might as well look in places no one else would think to, on the off chance the body had been dumped. He came to the base of a tall rocky slope, and halfway up he sees something. He looked at his binoculars, and sure enough, it was the body of a little boy stuffed in a little opening in the rock. He recognized the color of the kid's shirt, so he knew right away that it was the missing boy. That's when he called it in and we were dispatched. It took us almost an hour to get his body down, and none of us could believe what we were seeing. Not only was this kid 15 miles from where he started, there was no possible way he could have gotten up there on his own. The slope was treacherous, and it was hard even for us with our climbing gear. A 5-year-old boy had no way of getting up there. Of that I'm certain. Not only that, but the kid didn't have a scratch on him. His shoes were gone, but his feet weren't damaged or dirty. So it wasn't as if an animal dragged him up there. And from what we could tell, he hadn't been dead for that long. He'd been out there for over a month by that point, and it looked like he'd been dead for at most a day or 2. The whole thing was unbelievably strange and was one of the most disconcerting calls I've ever been on. We found out later that the coroner determined the kid had died from exposure. He'd frozen to death, probably late by the night of the 2 days before we found him. There were no suspects and no answers. To date, it's one of the weirdest things I've ever seen. One of the first jobs as a trainee was a search op for a 4-year-old kid that had gotten separated from his mom. That was one of those cases where we knew we were going to find him because the dogs were on a strong scent trail, and we saw clear signs that he was in the area. We ended up finding him in a berry patch about half a mile from where he'd been seen last. The kid wasn't even aware that he had wandered that far. One of the vets brought him back, which I was glad for because I'm really not good with kids, and I find it hard to talk to them and keep them company. As my trainer and I were headed back, she decided to take me on a detour to show me one of the hot spots we were tend to finding missing people. It was a natural dip in the land near a popular trail, and people would usually move downhill because it was easier. We hiked out there. It was a few miles away, and we got there in about an hour or so. As we were walking around the area and she was pointing out places that she'd found people in the past, I saw something in the distance. Now, this area we're in is about 8 miles from the main parking area, though there's back roads you can take to get closer if you don't want to hike that far. But we were on state protected land, which meant there couldn't be any kind of commercial or residential development out there. The most you'll ever see is a fire tower or makeshift shelter that homeless people think they can get away with building. But I can see from here that whatever this thing is has straight edges, and if there's one thing you learn quickly, it's that nature rarely makes straight lines. I pointed it out, but she didn't say anything. She just hung back and let me wander over and check it out. I got within about 20 feet of it, and all the hair on the back of my neck stood up. It's a staircase in the middle of the fucking woods. In the proper context, it would literally be the most benign thing ever. It's just a normal staircase with beige carpet and about 10 steps tall. But instead of being in a house, where it obviously should be, it's out here in the middle of the woods. The sides aren't carpeted, obviously, and I can see the wood it's made of. It's almost like a video game glitch where the house is failed to load completely and the stairs are the only thing visible. I stood there and it was like my brain was working overtime to try and make sense of what I'm seeing. My trainer came and stood next to me, and she just stood there casually looking at it as if it's the least interesting thing in the world. I asked her what the fuck this thing is doing here, and she just chuckled. Get used to it, rookie. You're going to see a lot of them. I started to move closer, but she grabbed my arm hard. I wouldn't do that, she said. Her voice was casual, but her grip was tight, and I just stood there looking at her. You're going to see them all the time, but don't go near them. Don't touch them. Don't go up them. Just ignore them. I started to ask her about it, but something in the way she was looking at me told me that it was best if I didn't. We ended up moving on, and the subject didn't come up again for the rest of my training. She was right. I have to say, about every fifth call I go on, I end up running across a set of stairs. Sometimes they're relatively close to the path, maybe within 2 or 3 miles. Sometimes they're 20, 30 miles out, literally in the middle of nowhere. And I only find them during the broadest searches or training weekends. They're usually in good condition, but sometimes it looks like they've been out there for miles. All different kinds, all different sizes. The biggest I ever saw looked like it came out of a turn-of-a-century mansion, and were at least 10 feet wide with steps leading up to at least 15 or 20 feet. I've tried talking about it with people, but they just give me that same response my trainer did. It's normal. Don't worry about it. They're not a big deal, but don't go close to them or up to them. When trainees ask me about it now, I give them the same response. I really don't know what else to tell them. I'm really hoping someday I'll get a better answer, but it hasn't happened yet. This is another one that was less spooky and more sad. A young man went missing late in winter when realistically no one should be going that far out on the trail. We closed a lot of them, but some of them remained open year-round, unless there was a shitload of snow. We didn't opt for him, but we had about 6 feet of snow on the ground. It was an unusually heavy snow year, and we knew it wasn't likely that we'd find him until the spring when the thaw came. Sure enough, when the first big thaw came, a hiker reported a body a little ways off the main trail. We found them at the base of a tree in a pile of melted snow. I knew right away what had happened, and it scared the living shit out of me. Most of you who ski or snowboard or spend any amount of time on a mountain will probably have guessed too. When snow falls, it doesn't collect as thick in the areas beneath the branches. It happens most with fir trees because they have a sort of closed umbrella shape. So what you end up with is a space around the base of a tree that fills up with a mixture of loose powdery snow, air, and branches. They're called tree wells, and they're not immediately obvious if you don't know what you're looking for. We put up signs in the Welcome Center, big ones, letting people know how dangerous they are. But every year we get an unusual amount of snow. At least one person doesn't read them or doesn't take the warning seriously, and we find out about it in spring. My best guess is that this young man was hiking and got tired, or maybe a cramp from walking in the deep snow. He went to go sit at the base of the tree, not knowing that there was a tree well, and fell in. He got stuck with his feet up, and the surrounding snow caved in around him. Unable to free himself, he suffocated. It's called snow immersion, suffocation. It doesn't usually happen except in really deep snow. But if you get stuck in a weird position, like this guy did, even 6 feet of snow can be lethal. What scared me the most was imagining how he must have struggled, upside down, in the freezing cold. He didn't die quickly. The snow would have formed a dense, heavy pile on top of him, and it would have been literally impossible to get out. As it got harder to breathe, he would have known what was happening. I can't even imagine what he was thinking in his last moments. A lot of my less outdoorsy friends want to know if I've ever seen the Goat Man while I've been out on calls. Unfortunately, or I guess fortunately, I've never had anything quite like that happen. I guess the closest was the whole black-eyed man thing, but I didn't see anything. However, there was one call where I had something kind of similar happen, but I'm not sure I'm willing to chalk it up to Goat Man. We'd gotten a report that an older woman had fainted along one of the trails and needed assistance getting back down to the main area. We'd hike up to where she was at, and her husband was just beside himself. He runs, well, I guess more jogs to us, and tells us that he was a little ways off the trail looking at something when his wife started screaming behind him. He ran back to her, and she's passed out on the trail. We got on her backboard, and as we're getting her down to the Welcome Center, she comes to and starts screaming again. I calmed her down and asked her what happened. I can't remember verbatim what she said, But essentially what happened was this. She'd been waiting for her husband when she started hearing this really strange sound. She said it sounded sort of like a cat, but it was off somehow, and she couldn't quite figure out why. She went a little ahead to try and hear it better, and it sounded like it was coming closer. She said the closer it got, the more uneasy she was feeling, until she finally figured out what was wrong. I do remember this next part because it was so weird that I don't think I could forget it if I tried. It wasn't a cat. It was a man, saying the word meow over and over, just meow, meow, meow. But it wasn't a man. It couldn't have been, because I've never heard a man make his voice buzz like that. I thought my hearing aid was going out, but it wasn't. I adjusted it and it still sounded all buzzy. It was awful. He was coming closer, but I couldn't see him, and the closer he got, the more scared I was, and the last thing I remember was a shape coming out of the trees. I guess that's when I fainted. Now, obviously, I was a little perplexed as to why a guy would be in the fucking woods chanting meow, meow at people. So once we got down the mountain, I told my superior that I was going to search the area to see if I could find anything. He gave me the go-ahead, and I grabbed the radio and hiked back to where she fainted. I didn't see anyone, so I kept going about a mile more, and then I headed back off the trail to see if I could figure out where she saw him coming from. It was almost sunset by this point, and I didn't have any desire to be out at night alone, so I just sort of wrote it off and made a mental note to check it out again the following day. But as I was headed back, I started to hear something in the distance. I stopped. I called out for anyone in the immediate area to identify themselves. The sound didn't come closer or get louder, but it sounded exactly like a man saying meow, meow, and this really odd monotone. As comical as it may sound, it was almost like that guy on South Park with the electrolarynx, Ned. I went off the trail in the direction I thought it was coming from, but I never seemed to get closer. It almost like it was coming from all directions. Eventually, it just sort of faded out, and I ended up going back to the Welcome Center. It didn't get any further reports like that, and even though I went back to that area, I never heard that exact sound again. I suppose it could have been some stupid kid out there fucking with people, but even I have to admit that it was weird.